Good morning, everyone. My name is Christy Westland. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the FND research group. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you as part of this course on FND. So I'm going to be focusing on predictive processing to give you a sense of how we can use this as a framework to help understand what might be going awry in the brains of patients with FND, and how we've used this to interpret some of our recent neuroimaging findings. So traditionally, the brain has been thought of as something that reacts to the world, where sensory signals come in, the brain processes them, and then reacts in some way. But recent theories actually propose something quite different, that the brain functions predictively. So it's thought to be constantly generating predictions or guesses about what's about to happen, both in the body and in the world. And it's using past experiences to help inform these guesses. So it's asking, in the current context that I'm in, what is likely to happen next based on my past experience? And then it's checking those guesses against incoming sensory information. So rather than a reactive brain where things are simply happening to you and reactions are hardwired based on the stimuli you encounter, there's a lot more agency and variation in how people might respond from a predictive view, because your predictions are directly informed by your own past experiences that are continually being adjusted and refined over the course of your life. So how does this adjustment or refinement take place? If what the brain predicts matches what it senses, great. The prediction will be strengthened, and you'll likely predict the same thing the next time you're in a similar situation. But if there's a mismatch between what is predicted and actual incoming sensory data, that is called a prediction error. And the brain has to decide what to do with that mismatch. So if the new information from the body or the world is not thought to be reliable or not important, it might ignore this information and not update predictions at all. But if the new information is reliable or it is important, it will update those predictions so that the next time you encounter a similar situation, you have updated predictions that are even better suited for that situation. And this is just a fancier way of framing what we call learning. So to summarize this overarching framework of predictive processing, the brain is constantly making guesses or predictions about what's happening. And then it's testing those guesses against incoming sensory information and learning from the results. And sometimes the incoming sensory information might be weighted more strongly than the priors or predictions. So your experience is mainly informed by sensory input. Whereas other times, sensory input might be weaker and you have really strong priors, so your experience is mainly informed by your predictions. And so next, I am going to show a quick demonstration of how your experience can be shaped by your predictions. So I'm going to play a video clip, but first I'll tell you that the sound that you'll hear in this video are the words green needle. So if you could hear that okay, I'm guessing that most of you did hear the words green needle. And now I'm going to play this same video again, but this time what it's actually saying is brainstorm. So I was playing the same video both times, but your prediction of what you were going to hear was shaping your experience even though the sensory input was identical. And this is sort of a more conscious example of predictive processing, but this process is occurring continuously and unconsciously throughout our daily lives. Another example of this comes from pain research. So if you assign participants to either a control condition, telling them they're being given a control cream with no effects, or to a placebo condition where they're told they're being given a pain relieving drug, and then you present both groups with the same painful stimulus, those who expected the stimulus to hurt less will actually rate their experience of the stimulus as less painful. And the same goes for the opposite. When people expect something to hurt more, they'll rate it as more painful. So this is just another example of how your predictions can shape what you actually experience. And those are relatively harmless examples of predictive processing in action. But now imagine a scenario where your predictions are not well suited for the current environment. So if your brain predicts that an environment is going to be more painful or more threatening or more dangerous than it actually is, your body will engage in processes to respond to those threats when it doesn't need to be. And in a healthy brain, these incorrect predictions are able to be updated appropriately. So you're able to properly adapt and learn based on sensory inputs. But if these processes go awry, your predictions might be too rigid, not updated appropriately, and you might become stuck in a maladaptive cycle where you're continually predicting incorrectly for your current environment and engaging in actions to encounter threatening stimuli when you aren't actually in a threatening situation. And this is how a variety of symptoms are thought to manifest across disorders from a predictive processing view. So we can use this as a framework to look at the brain and try to understand what might be going on in different clinical populations like FND. And from predictive processing, individual brain regions are not thought to have one specific job. So for example, in the past, you might have heard someone say that the amygdala is the brain's emotion center or fear center or something similar. But from predictive processing, the brain is thought to operate through groups of regions that work together to perform specific functions rather than individual regions having a particular function. And we call these groups of regions working together brain networks. So before I go any further and show you brain images of what networks we think are involved in predictive processing, I wanted to just quickly go over how to look at some of the images I'm going to show. So because the surface of the brain is highly folded, in order to visualize findings from within these folds, we inflate the brain like a balloon. And so here is a quick video showing this. I'll show this one more time. Okay, so we can look at these inflated brains for the left and right hemisphere from an outer view, which we call a lateral view, and from an inner view, which we call a medial view, which is what it would look like if you split the brain in half and we're looking at the inside portion of each hemisphere. So this is how I'll be showing some brain images in the next few slides. So we can map the main components of predictive processing onto different functional brain networks, including the default mode, salience, and frontoparietal networks. The default mode network is thought to be involved in generating prediction signals. So it's providing the brain's best guess about what's likely happening. The salience network is thought to be involved in processing prediction error signals. So it's acting like the brain's error detector and spotlighting when something unexpected or something important happens, and it's helping to decide when to pay attention or when it's safe to ignore these signals. And the frontoparietal network is thought to help regulate how much importance to give to either the predictions or the prediction error signals. And we call this precision signaling. So it's helping to sort of fine tune how confident the brain should be in its predictions versus in the incoming sensory signals. And like I mentioned earlier, problems with how these networks function are thought to contribute to symptoms across disorders. And of course, we are specifically interested in how they're involved in FND. So in recent research from our lab, our goal has been to see whether there are alterations in communication within and across these brain networks in FND. So in one recent project, we looked at the brains of patients with FND compared to psychiatric controls, and we asked whether they differed in terms of the connections within these functional networks, which we call segregation, between these functional networks, which we call network integration, or whether it's a problem of both. And here we used psychiatric controls, which was a group of patients who were matched to the FND cohort on age, sex, depression, anxiety, and PTSD severity. And we wanted to compare FND against these psychiatric controls as opposed to using healthy controls like most other studies have done, because patients with FND often have prominent psychiatric comorbidities. And so by comparing against a psychiatric control group, we can understand whether our findings are specific to FND rather than being attributed to their psychiatric comorbidities. Okay, so looking first at differences in the segregated within network connections, this is what we saw. Overall, you can see that the brain map is largely empty. There weren't widespread differences between the groups. But we did see a small region on both the left and right inner view that we call the anterior cingulate. And this region had increased segregation in FND. And it's part of the frontoparietal network, which is the network that is involved in regulating how much importance to give to either predictions or prediction errors. So regions of this network might be overly segregated in FND and not communicating appropriately with other networks. And the more segregated it was across participants, the worse someone's somatic symptoms were. So this speaks to the clinical relevance a bit. Our more robust findings were when we looked at between network integration connections. So here you can see that a lot more of the brain is red, which is showing regions where FND had higher between network communication compared to the controls. And these regions are largely overlapping with what we call the somatomotor network. And this is a network that is involved in sending and receiving somatosensory and motor signals. We also wanted to see where this network had increased connections to. And so we saw that it was primarily connected to default mode, frontoparietal, and salience network regions, which are those three main networks involved in predictive processing. So we were seeing heightened crosstalk or heightened communication between regions involved in sensory and motor function with regions involved in predictive processing. And we again looked to see if this was clinically relevant, and we found that those who had the greatest increases in this between network communication also reported the most severe somatic symptoms. So to summarize, the main findings of the study pointed towards FND being a problem of abnormal between network communication, largely between the network involved in somatosensory and motor functioning, and networks involved in predictive regulation of the body. So this might be reflective of somatosensory and motor predictions that are dominating in a maladaptive way. And as sort of a quick sneak peek, we have a paper under review right now that is showing that patients who improved more after 6 months of naturalistic individualized treatment actually showed greater reductions in this abnormal between network communication. So treatment seems to be reducing the abnormal connectivity between these networks. And the last thing that I'm going to show you are a few findings from one other recent study of ours. And here, rather than parcellating the brain into discrete networks, we were looking at a more macro scale level of brain organization that shows sort of smoother transitions in connectivity. And we call these smooth transitions connectivity gradients. So we wanted to see whether patients with FND showed any differences in brain organization in this more global sense. Okay, so I'm only going to show results from one gradient, and this gradient shows transitions in connectivity anchored on one end by sensory motor regions, which are shown here in sort of a darker purple or blue color. And the other end in orange and red are what we call association regions, which are largely default mode and frontoparietal network regions, which again are predictive processing regions. And so in a healthy brain, these networks are the most distinct in terms of their functioning along this gradient. So they should not be connected to each other, they're maximally distinct. But what we saw in FND was that somatomotor regions were actually shifting towards behaving more like association regions. So here we're again seeing a shift in somatomotor regions being more connected to predictive regions in FND. And these shifts were also related to the severity of somatic symptoms. Okay, so again, in the study, we were seeing altered functional brain organization in FND with alterations in regions involved in somatosensory and motor functioning, shifting more towards behaving like regions involved in predictive processing, which again may be reflective of a mode of functioning where aberrant sensory motor predictions are dominating and not being flexibly updated. So to summarize across everything that I've talked about today, FND symptoms may arise from aberrant predictive processing. This is all theoretical. There might be other explanations for what we're seeing, but our neuroimaging evidence is supporting that there is aberrant connectivity with the networks involved in predictive functioning. And to put this all in the context of the course today, your work as allied health professionals is central to the process of helping to restore normal functioning in these networks. The interventions that you're providing to patients are changing the way the brain's networks are functioning. So every time you help a patient move appropriately in a given situation or focus their attention appropriately, you're providing new data for the brain that's challenging those faulty predictions. And over time, the brain can start to recalibrate and rewire. So with that, I wanted to thank our research team and everyone involved in this work, and thank all of you for listening today.